we have with us an authority, Jay Dickey. Jay, can you hear us okay? Good.
Sort of. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We can hear you and see you just fine.
Good.
Let me tell you a little about Jay. Jay is an SAR member extraordinaire. He's a member of the California Society and a member of the Gold Country chapter. He's a member of the Nevada Society, a past president of the Nevada Society, and a past governor of the Nevada Mayflower organization. And he's also a member of the Utah Society. He is an author, he's a lecturer, he has done extensive history, certainly including the Revolutionary War. He's president of the American Heritage Partners, and he is a descendant of 12 Patriot ancestors. So he is one of us, up a level or two for most of them. So, Jay, we are so happy to have you with us. Thank you for your patience. We have a big crowd today. Our lunch went a little long, but thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dick. And hopefully you can all hear me. Just wave your arms if you can't. The miracle of the Owl 360. I can see all of you quite well, and looks like you're enjoying a fine lunch there. And thank you to the Cascade Centennial Chapter for inviting me to talk to you today. Greetings from the Silver State, by the way. As Dick mentioned, I'm now a full-time resident of the state of Nevada, the land of sagebrush and wild horses. So come on down and visit sometime. It's quite a nice place. So we are in the year of America 250, big time, and of course we're all here today to think about and commemorate the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord. You all know that all over the country, celebrations and commemorations are taking place, most notably back in Massachusetts. 2 weeks hence, there's going to be among other things, a recreation of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride on the 18th, and the next day in Lexington and Concord, reenactors, thousands and thousands of people will gather. And I kind of wish we all lived back east to be able to partake of that. We're not able to be there, but we'll be there in spirit for sure. As Dick mentioned, I do have 12 Patriot ancestors. Among them, I had 2 who answered the alarm at Lexington, as was true of so many Patriots, however, who answered the alarm. They got there too late. It was over relatively quickly, and so some of the outlying towns, they sent their militiamen, and the party was over. So that was the case with my 2. Today, I'm not going to really be covering the battlefield tactics. Not going to be talking about, who fired the first shot, that sort of thing. Instead, I'm going to try to give you a different perspective, and really a perspective about the key players and their stories. And of course, in the middle of it, Paul Revere, and I'll be talking a fair amount about him. So let's just, with Edwin's help, see if I can get my slide deck up. Are you able to see it? Can you see the slides?
Yeah, I can.
Great. Okay. So my talk's entitled Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, the Shot Heard Around the World. One of the famous etchings of him tearing through the streets of probably Charleston. And of course, we know that a lot of the mythology of the Midnight Ride stems from Longfellow's poem from the 1800s, in which he depicted Paul Revere as the lone rider who left Boston and screamed out to all the people along the way, the British are coming. And the first thing I want to correct in that is nobody said that. Nobody called the British soldiers British, because everybody was still British. They called them the regulars. And so if you're going to read any book about Paul Revere's ride, don't rely upon the poem. It really isn't the authoritative source. I will mention 2 books. I'm going to hold up one here. This book won the Pulitzer Prize back in the 1940s. It's probably the seminal book about Paul Revere and his world, as that's entitled, The World He Lived in. Esther Forbes wrote this one. The second one I commend to your reading. Some of you may have read it. David Hackett Fisher, he wrote Paul Revere's Ride, chock-a-block with facts and details and hour-by-hour accounts of what Paul Revere was doing during these critical weeks and days. Much of it derived from Paul Revere's own memoirs that he kept and he wrote and published. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the protagonists and antagonists in the drama. I'm not going to go back to the 1774 and prior time frame. It's difficult to talk to an audience of my SAR compatriots because I fear some of you know more about this subject than I do. And of course, we can talk for hours about the Tea Act and the other events that took place in 1774, the Intolerable Acts. All of that is the prehistory to what I'm going to talk about, which is these critical months from January to March, leading up to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. A fair amount about Paul Revere's involvement in all of this, a little bit about the actual battle, and then the aftermath, and so forth. So I'm going to talk very fast. I apologize in advance because I got a lot to cover. There'll be a lot of pictures. So fortunately, there's a lot of slides, but it's a lot of pictures. So let me start with some of the key protagonists. On the left, you see General Thomas Gage. Now, Gage, I think, was between a rock and a hard place. He had been serving as the commander-in-chief since 1763. That was the end of the French and Indian War. He became the governor in May of 1774, the governor of the Massachusetts colony, replacing Thomas Hutchinson, who was sort of unceremoniously shown the door after the Boston Tea Party and so forth. And he was really, although he was not present at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, he was controlling a lot of the activity, certainly preceding it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll also talk about his wife, and I'm not going to give away the story, but his wife plays a prominent role in all of this as well. On the right, you see Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. It was Smith who led the main body of the troops from Boston out to Lexington. More on that later. He was 52 years old. I should mention some ages here. So General Gage was 55 years old. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, 52 years old. Relatively, older soldiers across the board, as you'll see in a minute. But on both sides of this activity. Also on the British side, protagonists, Hugh Percy. He was with the 5th Regiment of Foot. He was a younger man at 33 years old. He was from the House of Percy. He was the 2nd Duke of Northumberland. He was one of the richest men in England, and yet he came to America as a soldier and ended up playing a critical role in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It was Percy who took command after the catastrophe at Concord. He served as leading the rear guard on the way back to Boston, another disaster. He was the commander during the Battle of Monotony, which some of you are aware was the most lethal phase of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. We might as well call it the Battle of Monotony, at which over 6,000 soldiers on both sides did battle at this tiny hamlet of Monotony. The British lost 40 men killed. The rebels lost 25 men killed. This was all Hugh Percy leading the British side of that. On the right, you see Major John Pitcairn, probably in reverse order. He was more responsible back in Concord for the violence that took place there. He was older, 53 years old. He was a son of a priest. He was the person on scene when the firing started at Lexington. He was on leading edge of this. He was in the advance guard before the main body led by Lieutenant Colonel Smith come along. And that's when the firing started. He was there with his smaller advance guard when everything went to hell. He had his horse shot out from under him. He lost his pistols, and ironically, later on, somehow General Israel Putnam of the Continental Army inherited John Pitcairn's pistols and never gave them back. On the antagonist side, of course, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. There were so many. I single out these two because it was Adams and Hancock who figured most prominently in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. They were the targets, as I'll explain in a couple of minutes. At that point, Adams was 53 years old, sort of the same age bracket as the generals of the British Army. Hancock was a much younger man. He was 38 years old. And this is the most unlikely duo you could have imagined at the time. Adams, the firebrand, the pot stirrer, the guy who really led the entire rebel cause in the years preceding Lexington and Concord, of course, a cousin of John Adams. Hancock was the money man. He kind of backed into his role after inheriting a business that made him the wealthiest man in the colony, and he became a member of the Sons of Liberty. He became a bankroller of so much, and he was very prominently the first president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which had been convening right before the Battle of Lexington and Concord in Concord itself. And it was because of that meeting of the Provincial Congress that the two of them found themselves in Lexington at the receiving end of the march of the British troops. They were the targets. He, of course, later on became president of the Continental Congress after Lexington and Concord, and he oversaw the Committee of Safety, which played a prominent role with Paul Revere, which I'll get to in a moment. Going further back in time in the run-up to Lexington and Concord, Joseph Warren, we all know he was perhaps the most prominent organizer of the Sons of Liberty and the cause. And to his right, James Otis, a more forgotten figure in both the Revolutionary period and in the battle itself. He was 50 years old. Warren, a much younger man, 34 years old. Warren had been heading the Committee of Correspondence at that time with an infamous character I'll talk about at the end of this talk, Benjamin Church. And you may know his name as a villain in this entire story. Warren had remained in Boston during most of this time. He did make an appearance, however, at the end of the Lexington and Concord battles, coming out at the tail end, joining General William Heath on the mission to continue to harass, vex, and annoy the British troops as they were coming back to Boston. And of course, Joseph Morton was killed not too long after at Bunker Hill. Otis, he really was the mentor of Samuel Adams, and Adams said as much later on. John Adams described him, quote, Otis was a flame of fire, truly an instigator of the rebel cause. Later on, in 1771, Otis was still alive. John Adams described him as raving mad. What had happened was he had developed, we don't know if it was Alzheimer's or some other mental illness, but he became increasingly infirm over the years, and by the time of Lexington and Concord was kind of an irrelevancy, but it was in no small part due to James Otis that the rebel cause came together in the first place. The last antagonist I'll quickly mention is our hero, Paul Revere. I say artisan, townsman, Freemason, and member of the Sons of Liberty. He was all of those things and then some. And he was almost, I would say, almost an accidental leader of the rebel cause, and we'll talk about that too. First, a few words about his life in Boston before Lexington and Concord, and a quick biography, if you will. He was descended from French Huguenots. We all know they were the persecuted Protestants in France, who many of whom came to America to escape the French terrorism that was being visited upon the Huguenots. His father, Apollos Revere, came over as a young, basically apprentice to a silversmith in Boston. He immigrated in 1716. He married actually somebody well-born in Boston, and they had Paul. He was born on New Year's Day, 1735 in Boston, and they anglicized the French surname Revere to Revere, and he became Paul Revere as a result. He was, he was a city boy. I guess I'd put it that way. Married twice. His first wife, Sarah, born in, well, I don't know when she was born. They're married in 1757. They had 8 children. She passed away. He remarried Rachel Walker, 1773, right before the war years commenced. He had 8 more children with Rachel. That's Rachel on the right, and the reason I have her picture there as opposed to Sarah is Rachel did play a role herself during the period of the Lexington and Concord war, battle, and aftermath. When Paul's father died in 1754, he inherited the silversmith business that his father was running, and really for the next 20 years, up until the time of Lexington and Concord, he was as much a businessman as he was anything else, but he was involved in town affairs. He did play some political roles in the town, and for all intents and purposes, one of the leaders of the Boston community. He was, of course, and today best known as the silversmith. You see a couple of examples here. They are collector's items today. You can pay a very pretty penny for some of his pieces. Very little known story that Paul Revere was in his spare time also a dentist. And you see here, one thing, a set of dentures basically that can be found in Paul Revere House in Boston, which is a museum today. They believe this to be a set of false teeth that Paul Revere had made for one of his customers, during his dentistry years. He was, he started that practice in 1768. He was describing himself in newspaper ads as a surgeon dentist. And one of the most interesting aspects of his dental expertise is he's thought to be the very first forensic dentist. Why? Some of you know the story. When Joseph Warren was killed at Bunker Hill, he was in an unmarked grave for the better part of 8 months. And when the British left Boston, they asked Paul Revere to come out to help find Joseph Warren's remains and try to identify him. Well, he did that by looking at his teeth, because he had done some dentistry for Joseph Warren, and he recognized the 2 false teeth that he had put into Joseph Warren. So that's how we know that the remains they found were actually his. Revere, also a very little known fact, was kind of a man of medicine. He went on later in life to be the county coroner in Suffolk County for a number of years. He was president of the Boston Board of Health, and also developed some expertise in treating victims of mental health disease. So a lot of interesting things that Paul Revere was up to before, during, and after Lexington and Concord. All right, real quick. What was going on in those 3 months before Lexington and Concord? Well, we know that by January, a lot had happened in 1774, but New England was incredibly deeply divided. I call out here in the slide the Ruggles Covenant, just to remind ourselves that there was no unified view within New England about the crown, Parliament, taxation without representation. The populace was deeply divided. The Ruggles Covenant was actually adopted in Marshfield by an organization that had been formed there called the Associated Loyalists. And they were very proud and vocal loyalists. They formed their own militia and stood out quite prominently in support of the crown. And of course, they were surrounded by other towns in Plymouth Colony who were very strongly pro-rebel. Well, violence ensued, not just in January 1775, but even before that. A lot of mob actions were taking place against loyalists. It was violence in the streets. In February, the Provincial Congress convenes out in Concord, as I mentioned. Hancock becomes the president. The Loyalists are objecting mightily to this Provincial Congress, that it was unlawful, it was treasonous. There were a lot of attempts to shut it down unsuccessfully. The Loyalists were outmaneuvered by the rebels. And in that same month, General Gage, who's, like I say, between a rock and a hard place, he wants to know what's going on. He starts sending his troops out into the countryside to see firsthand what's happening, what's being organized. Is it a threat? And one of the things he did was he sent troops to Salem, where there was a large supply of gunpowder that was stored there. At least they thought so. They went out there and it wasn't there. It was later described as a ridiculous expedition. But he was trying hard to get his handle on what the countryside was feeling and thinking and doing. By March, the battle lines really had been drawn. Some epic speeches took place, as you may know, at the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, including Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, speechifying there. The newspaper propaganda was intense. And of course, Adams and his cousin John were both submitting and authoring a lot of anonymous tracts. Gage, in the meantime, had a lot of info from a loyalist spy. I put a question mark there. Some of you may want to guess who that person was. That will be revealed in a few minutes. March 24, the Provincial Congress publishes this broadside in which they're quite starkly saying our implacable enemies are unremitting in their endeavors by fraud and artifice, as well as by open force to subjugate this people. Be ready to oppose with firmness and resolution. You can't miss that war is coming when you read this excerpt from the Provincial Congress broadside. What's Gage doing? Gage is waiting to get orders from London. He needs to know what his marching orders are, quite literally. And he finally, on April the 16th, receives a letter from Lord Dartmouth. Somebody give me a warning when I'm running too long. Lord Dartmouth was the secretary of the colonies. Let me give you his exact correct title. Dartmouth College, by the way, was named after him. So Lord Dartmouth finally writes a letter in January. It doesn't get to Gage until April the 16th, but he reports and orders the king's dignity, honor, and safety require that in such a situation, force should be repelled by force. This is a clear instruction to Gage that he needs to meet the enemy. He needs to bring the battle to the colonists and, as you see in the second quotation, arrest and imprison the principal actors and abettors. Well, he knew that Adams and Hancock were out in Lexington, and he knew that mischief was afoot, no small part due to them. And so that was his marching orders. The trigger's now pulled. Revere, in the meantime, is very active as a quote unquote express. That was the word that was used then to describe somebody who was a horse-mounted messenger from here and there. And you can see that this was not a new thing for him. The first recorded ride that he took was back in 1773. This is a very short list. In David Fitcher's book, there's about 20 examples of him serving as a messenger before we get to April of 1775. There had been a belief that developed in Boston that the march of the British soldiers was going to happen in the first week of April. And so he went out there on April the 7th and 8th, as you see here, to warn the people of Concord. Well, that was a false alarm, but it did motivate the people of Concord to hide quickly the ammunition, cannons, provisions, foodstuffs, everything that could be hidden. That this was the tip-off on April the 8th that at some point, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, the British were coming. And so it was. The Midnight Ride. April the 18th, 10 p.m. Dr. Warren getting information from his sources that, in fact, the troops were about to leave Boston, heading to Lexington and Concord. He summons Revere over, and according to Revere's autobiography, he begged that I immediately set off for Lexington. And so he did. He left Boston 15 minutes later, covered 13 miles in 2 hours. And during that 2 hours, we remind ourselves, he was stopping very often to, knock on doors, warn people that the British were coming. I should say the regulars were coming. But he covered that territory in 2 hours. He arrived in Lexington at midnight. He knew that Adams and Hancock were staying at the Clark House. More about that in a second. And followed half an hour later by William Dawes, another forgotten character, the other writer that made his way out to Lexington that day, taking a different route. By 1 to 2 a.m., they had warned Adams and Hancock, and they were off to Concord. On the way, Revere's captured. His captors start to take him back to Lexington. They hear a shot. Oh my God, what's going on? They suddenly have fear for their own safety. They release Revere on his own recognizance, and he goes on to Lexington. The alarms are sounding, the bells are ringing, 2 a.m. in the morning. This is a map, not my map, but a very good map showing the ride itself. The blue line is Revere. The green line is William Dawes. He took a different route over the Boston Neck. Revere took a boat over to Charleston and proceeded. You see where there's a couple of red horses there. The British patrol turns back Revere. Well, he galloped away and took a side route up to Medford and around and got to Lexington ahead of Dawes. But these were the routes that the two followed to get out there. The first destination was Clark House. Now that was, today it's called the Hancock Clark House. Why do they call it that? Well, the house was actually built by John Hancock's grandfather, and he lived there. And as a boy, John Hancock actually lived in this house that they later occupied on the evening of April the 18th. It's now operated by the Lexington Historical Society. On the right is the famous Buckman's Tavern. Many of the militiamen were assembled there already by the time that Revere and Dawes arrived in town. And there was a lot of activity inside the tavern right then. Early morning, Revere has come back to Lexington from almost being captured and taken back by the regulars. He, Hancock, and Adams take off. They go over to Woburn. By the way, in Hancock's really elegant coach, I mean, a dead giveaway that somebody important is fleeing the scene. He's in his fancy coach doing this. Where's the salmon? So when Hancock and Adams and Revere left, Hancock had been looking forward to this really nice fresh salmon dinner, and they left the salmon behind. So when they get to Woburn, Hancock says, will somebody please go back and get my salmon? And they actually did that. They went back to the Clark House, got the salmon, brought it back. He ended up having a nice salmon dinner that night. What about my secret papers? In the second story of the tavern, he had left a trunk of very secret papers that could incriminate not only him, but everybody else in sight. So Revere goes back to get the trunk. And that's when the Battle of Lexington breaks out, is as Revere's trying to haul this trunk out of the tavern to safety. Well, he's doing that as the first shots erupt, and he and another rebel are carrying this off into the woods. So that's what Revere was doing during the battle, was trying to take Hancock's secret papers to him in this trunk. This trunk still exists. It's in the Paul Revere House Museum in Boston. You can see it. So they leave Woburn, and because the attack is coming their way, they think, so Adams and Hancock depart Woburn. They go off into the countryside. Adams loves the fact that war has broken out. I mean, this was all Samuel Adams was hoping for. And so he turns to Hancock in the carriage and says, "It is a fine day." He was excited that finally the rebel cause was going to be taken into its final phase. Revere gets back to Cambridge the next day. He starts working for the Committee of Safety, again, as an express rider. And for the next several weeks, that's all he's doing, is writing for the Committee of Safety hither and yon. We don't know exactly what those activities were. So that on the 19th, the regulars are making their disastrous retreat. The rebels have now been reinforced, and among others, Brigadier General William Heath takes command of the forces as they're chasing the British regulars back to Boston. He's joined by, of all people, Dr. Joseph Warren. We don't really think of Warren as a soldier or a militant except at Bunker Hill, but he was actually at Battle Road as that battle was ensuing. And for the next 4 hours, the rebels were chasing the British troops back to Charleston. And really, that was the defining event, everybody, I think, concludes today, for the rebel cause. It demonstrated that they could be an organized and effective fighting force. Heath, by the way, went on to some fame. He was assigned the task after the Battle of Saratoga to take care of the thousands of British prisoners that were taken when Burgoyne surrendered. And so that was one of his main jobs later on, following Saratoga in 1777. This is a photograph that was taken when photography was brand new of Battle Road. And you can kind of visualize. I love this photograph because it kind of gives you this ability to see the battle in some respects. This was a very difficult march for the troops, and you can see how the rebels off in the trees to each side could, very methodically pick off the officers and then pick off the horses. It was a disaster. So news of the battle spread like wildfire. You can't read this. I concede. But it was somebody's attempt to show when the news of the Lexington and Concord battle got around the rest of the colonies. Interestingly, a ship left Newport Harbor and went all the way down to North Carolina, was there on the 22nd before news even got to New York. So all up and down the seacoast, express riders were bringing the news of the battle over these coming weeks. So the immediate aftermath, as in days, Gage decides, okay, I'm gonna hunker down. I'm gonna clamp down on the citizens. They cannot leave unless I give them permission, and they can't leave without turning in the weapons. Well, it turned out that the citizens of Boston were very well armed. They turned in order to get out of town. They turned in over 1,700 firearms that they had in their homes, and lots of other paraphernalia of war that they were turning in. But as you can imagine, the rebel leaders, their family members, were leaving Boston. In the same breath, the loyalists were flooding into Boston for protection. The rebel leaders decided they needed a new headquarters. They reconvened in Watertown. That's where they then led the war effort. And Revere's living there in Watertown. Turns out, coincidentally, his bunkmate was Henry Knox, along with some other Whigs that were there. And he and Knox became fast friends as roommates in the John Cook House in Watertown in these days immediately following Lexington Concord. He gets his family to finally join him. They had a hard time getting out of town, and it took them weeks and weeks of negotiations for his wife and his children to join him come from Boston. In the meantime, Joseph Warren is writing to London, to Ben Franklin in particular, pleading with Franklin to work with sympathetic English political leaders to turn this thing around. He uses some pretty harsh language here, but he's basically saying to Franklin, please, please, please help us stop the insanity. And obviously Benjamin Franklin couldn't do anything. His hands were tied. April 30, Dr. Warren writing again. This was a call to arms. The barbarous murders of our innocent brethren on Wednesday the 19th has made it impossible, absolutely necessary that we immediately raise an army. This is going out quite broadly throughout Massachusetts and into the neighboring colonies. And the other colonies were generally developing not just sympathy for, but strong support for the Massachusetts cause. May through July, real quick, Continental Congress is created, the Second Continental Congress, that is, and they start meeting in May. Washington's commander-in-chief, of course, Bunker Hill in mid-June takes the life of Joseph Warren. Another turning point, however, because the colonists fought hard and killed a lot of British soldiers in the process. Washington didn't think much of his troops. He arrives in July, described them as exceedingly dirty and nasty people, and proceeded to try to whip them into shape, and the siege of Boston begins. In June, sadly, General Gage, caught in the middle of all this, is relieved of command. William Howe takes over, and Gage goes back to England in October. So what's up with Paul Revere in the meantime? He had tried valiantly to get into the army. For whatever reason, none of these biographies quite explain it. They won't take him. And so he's kind of a man without portfolio, but he is asked to start printing money for the new independent Massachusetts colony and ultimately the Continental Congress. This is an example of the very first currency he designed, engraved, and printed. I was showing Edwin the other day when we were rehearsing a little bit. I managed to track one of those down and buy it. So I have a copy of this, and you'll see on the back, it's what's called the sword and arms design on the back. It says, issued in defense of American liberty at the top, and the soldier's holding in his hand the Magna Carta. So that's one of his jobs. His war service, as I said, he didn't get into the Continental Army, but he did a lot of other things. In November, he began making gunpowder. He was sent to train himself on how to make it, and then he opened his own powder mill in Canton, Massachusetts. He then got stationed on Castle William in Boston Harbor, which was an island. It isn't anymore. Now it's a recreation area with swings and restaurants and so forth. But at the time, it was an important fort, which was ultimately destroyed. He had a couple of brief deployments in the militia, but nothing significant, no real combat per se. His worst moment, as you see in the last bullet, some of you know about the Penobscot expedition. It was one of the worst outings for the American troops in the history of the Revolution. Unfortunately, Revere was in charge of the artillery, and for whatever reasons, there was a court-martial that took place over all of this. He didn't bring the cannons to the battle. He was accused of cowardice and insubordination. He asked for a court-martial. He said, I need to clear my name. And he got a trial, and he was finally exonerated in 1782. But his war service, in a nutshell, was not illustrious. He did contribute some other things, though. You see on the left, a Paul Revere and Sons cannon. He started producing cannons in large quantities during the Revolution, became one of the leading manufacturers of cannons. As a sidelight, he started making brass bells. And you see one of those on the right, and there are many of them still extant in church towers all over New England and elsewhere. So he was busy. He just wasn't able to do what he wanted to do, which was to be a soldier and a leader of men. His final years. This is a painting of him in his final years. Obviously, he's grayed out. He lived another 40 years after Lexington and Concord, established a thriving copper business, which was an incredibly big breakthrough when he learned how to, he was the first to learn how to mass produce rolled copper. And the State House in Massachusetts is covered with rolled copper produced by the Revere Copper Company. It is still in existence today. He outlived his wife and his son, Paul Jr. They died in 1813, turned the business over. He dies at age 83, a long life. And as you see in the quote here, seldom has the tomb closed upon a life so honorable and useful. If you give me another 2 minutes, I want to quickly cover some forgotten heroes. I mentioned Gage's wife, Margaret Kimball Gage. At the time of Lexington and Concord, she was 41 years old. She was American-born to a very good New England family. She married General Gage, but many historians, most historians, believe that she was a spy and that she was the person who leaked confidential information to Dr. Warren on April the 18th that the British soldiers were about to march. No coincidence, perhaps, right after Lexington and Concord, General Gage sent her home to London, and they were estranged the rest of their married years. So if all that's true, she was indeed a hero. How about the two guys that manned the bells? I should say manned the lanterns at Old North Church? John Pulling and Robert Newman. They were young guys who, really had incredible courage to evade the soldiers who were everywhere, to make their way with Revere's agreement that they would do this, make their way to Old North Church, take two lanterns up to the top. That's some 200 stairs they had to climb that evening, and hang two lanterns because, to if by sea, Revere knew that the British troops were crossing the bay to Charleston in boats. So hence there was no question, was it one lantern or two? They were set up with two lanterns to warn the people of Charleston, and that then spread like wildfire to the rest of the settlements that the regulators were going. Forgotten hero, Billy Dawes. I mentioned him earlier. He was only 30 years old, and it was Joseph Warren who sent him along with Revere out to Lexington. He took that other circuitous route, getting there a little bit later. He escaped. He didn't try to go on to Concord. After he escaped capture, he went back to Lexington, fought at Bunker Hill, became commissary to the Continental Army later on. Thank you, Billy Dawes. Another forgotten hero. Who knows who Samuel Prescott was? He was yet the third rider, and he was the only of the three that actually made his way to Concord. I mentioned Revere went back to Lexington. Dawes went back to Lexington. Samuel Prescott escaped. He evaded being captured himself. He went to Concord, and he was the one and only rider to warn the people of Concord that we really mean it, they're coming now. He became a privateer in the Navy, the American Navy, captured. He died in prison. All right, who was the villain? This is my last slide, folks. Who was the villain? Benjamin Church. He was in the inner sanctum of the rebel cause. He was there with Adams, Hancock, and all of them. 41 years old. He was the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, but he was also a traitor. It was Church who was routinely, regularly, frequently spilling the beans to General Gage about what the rebels were up to the very last minute. And he was finally revealed when his mistress, who he had asked to take one of his traitorous correspondences to General Gage, instead handed it to a rebel, and he was found out. He was also a thief because Revere had asked him to go to his wife to get some money because he was out in the countryside without any money to support himself. And he asked his wife to get some money. She got it. She gave it to Benjamin Church, and he stole it, never to be seen again. He died at sea a few years later, so he lived in ignominy. All right, I sped through a lot of material there. Happy to take your questions. I hope this was interesting, a different kind of take on Lexington and Concord than just the battlefield tactics. And thank you for letting me talk.